The rich daughter, with a heart of stone and eyes that reflected only the gleam of gold, saw in her wheelchair-bound mother not a bond of blood, but a burden, an impediment that tarnished her image and drained her patience. With calculating coldness, she did not dirty her hands with direct violence. Instead, she locked the fragile woman in a giant birdcage, a cruel irony for someone who could barely move. The cage was then carefully positioned at the edge of a colossal waterfall where the merciless current and the abyss awaited. The daughter watched from afar with the silent certainty that nature, in its brutal indifference, would do the dirty work. "Nature will take care of it," she murmured, as the cage slowly began to give way. Sliding towards the edge of the precipice, the mother inside it, a silent scream caught in her throat. But the instant the metal groaned, about to plunge into the void, a lion, an imposing and wild force, emerged from the shadows of the forest. It was not a predator in search of prey, but an unexpected guardian. With a powerful and precise lunge, it reached the cage in mid-air, biting the robust hook at the top with astonishing strength. The beast held the cage suspended in its mouth, a living counterweight against gravity, preventing the wheelchair-bound mother from falling into the icy abyss. The woman's life, abandoned by her own flesh and blood, now rested in the mouth of a wild king. The mother's breath, caught by a thread of terror and despair, now escaped in a silent gasp, a sound lost in the deafening roar of the waterfall. The world had stopped, or perhaps had turned upside down. A second before, she was plummeting to certain death, the abyss swallowing her. The next instant, the darkness of the fall was replaced by the sight of an imposing muzzle, teeth that could crush bones, but which now held her metal prison with astonishing precision. The cage, once a symbol of her helplessness, now swung precariously, a puppet suspended by the powerful jaw of a lion. The shock was so immense that the physical pain of her condition, the icy dampness that already enveloped her, all seemed distant. Her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on the animal. It was not the image of a hungry predator, but of a primordial force, a king of the jungle who, for some unfathomable reason, had become her improbable savior. The metal hook at the top of the cage was firmly lodged between the lion's teeth, its mouth agape in a monumental effort. The animal's neck muscles were taut, veins bulging, and a subtle tremor ran through its body, proof of the weight it bore against relentless gravity. Up above, on the edge of the precipice, the daughter watched, paralyzed. Her eyes, which once shone with the coldness of gold and the certainty of victory, now reflected a mixture of disbelief and contained fury. Nature, in its brutal indifference, should have done the dirty work. But nature, in a wild and unpredictable whim, had sent a guardian. The scene was grotesque, surreal. The mother, a burden she wanted to discard, now hanging over the abyss, saved by a wild beast. A low growl escaped the daughter's lips, a sound that echoed the frustration of a perfectly executed plan, now undone by an animalistic miracle. For the mother, time stretched out, each second an eternity, suspended between life and death. She could feel the lion's warm breath, the scent of earth and wildness emanating from its wet fur. The roar of the waterfall was an orchestra of destruction, and the icy spray lashed her face, reminding her of the proximity of the end that had been so cruelly postponed. Her body, already fragile and without the strength to move, was now dead weight inside the cage, each small movement threatening to unbalance the lion. She could not scream, she could not fight, only watch, a prisoner of fate and the jaw of a king. The lion, with visible effort, began to move. It was not a retreating movement, but a slow and agonizing attempt to reposition itself. Its hind legs, firmly planted on the slippery rock, scraped in search of traction. The animal's muscular body writhed, trying to pull the cage away from the edge of the precipice. Every inch was a battle against the weight, against the force of the water trying to drag the cage down, against its own exhaustion. The mother felt the cage sway, a lateral movement that made her hold her breath again. Would this be the end? Would the lion give in? The daughter, observing every movement, felt the venom of rage bubble in her veins. The sight of that animal, interfering with her design, was a personal affront. She wanted her mother to disappear, to be forgotten. And now, the woman was being displayed, a spectacle of cruelty and salvation. Her eyes scanned the landscape, searching for a solution, a way to regain control. That lion could not win. It could not. Meanwhile, the mother, amidst the terror, noticed something in the lion's golden eyes. There was no malice, no hunger. There was an intensity, a wild determination, almost a sense of purpose. Was it possible for an animal to feel compassion, or was it just a territorial instinct, a defense of its domain against the intrusion of that metal structure? She did not know. But at that moment, the lion's mouth was the only refuge between her and oblivion. The cage groaned again, a sharp sound that pierced the roar of the waterfall, and the lion let out a deep growl, a warning perhaps, or just the manifestation of its Herculean effort. The woman's life, suspended in the air, depended on a thread of metal and the untamed strength of a wild king, who now, slowly, very slowly, began to retreat inch by inch from the edge of the abyss. The tension was palpable, a tight knot in the throat of the world. The lion, a titan of strength and instinct, fought against the very nature of gravity. Every muscle in its body rippled under its wet fur, a silent testament to the Herculean effort. Its hind legs, once firmly planted, now scraped with more urgency on the damp, slippery rock, yielding millimeter by millimeter. A deep, guttural growl escaped its throat, not a roar of fury, but a sound of pure exhaustion and determination. The cage, a dead and inert weight, swayed with every movement of the animal, and the metal hook, still clamped between the lion's teeth, seemed about to give way at any moment. Inside, the mother, a statue of terror and fragility, felt the cage sway like a macabre pendulum. Her eyes, once fixed on the abyss, now alternated between the lion's imposing muzzle and the precipice that still awaited her. The animal's warm breath, mixed with the smell of wet earth and wildness, was a constant, almost suffocating presence, a vivid reminder of her improbable salvation. She could feel the tremor running through the lion's body, the palpable tension radiating from it. There was no malice in its golden eyes, only a fierce concentration, an obstinacy that defied logic. It was as if the lion had accepted a burden, a responsibility that was not its own, but which it carried with a wild dignity, an improbable guardian amidst the chaos. Atop the precipice, the daughter watched the scene with a fury that burned in her veins, an uncontrolled flame that consumed any shred of sanity. The lion, that wild intruder, was undoing her meticulous plan, transforming her calculated revenge into a grotesque spectacle. Her fists clenched, nails digging into her palms. The idea that her mother could be saved, and by an animal at that, was a personal affront. An unbearable humiliation. Her eyes, once cold and calculating, now gleamed with uncontrolled rage, scanning the edge of the precipice for anything, any object she could use to regain control. The lion, with a final effort that seemed to drain its last strength, managed to drag the cage a few more inches away from the edge. It was not enough for safety, but it was a minuscule victory against gravity. Its front paws, now firmer, found a protrusion on the rock, and it leaned in, using its full body weight to pull. The cage groaned, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed over the roar of the waterfall, and the mother felt a violent jolt. Her fragile body was thrown against the bars, and a moan escaped her lips, muffled by the sound of the water. The daughter saw the lion's progress, however small, and a cry of frustration escaped her throat. She could not allow it, not after everything. Her eyes fell upon a thick, heavy tree trunk that lay near the edge, washed ashore by the current during some previous flood. A cruel and desperate idea formed in her mind. With a force driven by rage, she grabbed the trunk, dragging it with difficulty to the edge of the precipice. The lion, still struggling to find purchase, felt a new disturbance. The ground trembled slightly, and a heavy dragging sound caught its attention. Its golden eyes, previously focused only on the task of pulling the cage, turned to the figure of the daughter above. There was a wild intelligence in its gaze, a recognition of the threat. It let out a louder growl, a warning as the daughter, with monumental effort, positioned the trunk. The mother inside the cage also perceived the new threat. Her wide eyes saw her daughter, a dark silhouette against the grey sky, holding the trunk. Terror chilled her blood. Her own daughter was trying to kill her again, using an even more brutal method. She tried to scream, but her voice was only a hoarse whisper, lost in the wind and the fury of the waterfall. The daughter, with a distorted smile of triumph and madness, pushed the trunk. The heavy wood rolled over the edge, falling towards the cage and the lion. It was not a direct blow, but an attack to destabilize, to force the lion to release the cage, to push everything into the abyss. The trunk spun in the air, a dark and menacing mass, descending rapidly. The lion, with surprising agility for its size and the precarious situation, reacted. It let out a thunderous roar, a sound of fury and defense that echoed through the canyon walls. With a swift and powerful movement of its head, it deflected the falling trunk, which struck the side of the cage with a dull thud. The impact made the cage spin violently, and the lion, unbalanced, slipped further on the wet rock. The mother was thrown from side to side, her body hitting the metal bars. The pain was excruciating, but the terror was even greater. She felt the cage tilt dangerously, the lion desperately fighting to maintain control. Its teeth were still clamped on the hook, but the effort was visible, almost unbearable. The waterfall's water, which before only splashed her, now enveloped her in an icy mist, almost swallowing her. The daughter, seeing her attack fail, let out a scream of rage. The lion, with a defiant look, managed to regain its footing, but at a terrible cost. It was closer to the edge than ever, and the force of the current seemed to pull the cage with more intensity. Its muscles trembled uncontrollably, and heavy breaths escaped in clouds of vapor. The mother's life, and perhaps the lion's own, hung by a thread, suspended between a daughter's fury and the untamed will of a wild king. The abyss roared, hungry, and time seemed to have stopped, awaiting the inevitable outcome. The lion, a monument of muscle and instinct, fought against the inevitable. Every fiber of its being screamed in protest against the weight of the cage, against the relentless force of the waterfall that tried to drag it into the abyss. Its hind legs, once firm, now scraped with desperate urgency on the slippery rock, yielding millimeter by millimeter. A deep, guttural growl escaped its throat, not a roar of fury, but a sound of pure exhaustion and determination, a silent lament of a wild king on the verge of its own limit. The metal hook, still clamped between its powerful teeth, seemed about to give way, to bend under the unbearable pressure at any moment. Inside, the mother, a broken body and a tattered soul, felt the cage sway like a macabre pendulum, each oscillation a warning of imminent death. Her eyes, once fixed on the abyss that awaited her, now alternated between the lion's imposing muzzle and the precipice that still called to her. The animal's warm breath, mixed with the smell of wet earth and wildness, was a constant, almost suffocating presence. A vivid reminder of her improbable salvation. She could feel the tremor running through the lion's body, the palpable tension radiating from it. There was no malice in those golden eyes, only a fierce concentration, an obstinacy that defied logic. It was as if the lion had accepted a burden, a responsibility that was not its own, but which it carried with a wild dignity, an improbable guardian amidst the chaos. The pain from the trunk's impact still throbbed in her body, but the terror of seeing her own daughter try again with such cold cruelty superseded any physical suffering. Atop the precipice, the daughter watched the scene with a fury that burned in her veins, an uncontrolled flame that consumed any shred of sanity. The lion, that wild intruder, was undoing her meticulous plan, transforming her calculated revenge into a grotesque spectacle of resistance and salvation. Her fists clenched, nails digging into her palms, a minuscule sacrifice before the rage that dominated her. The idea that her mother could be saved, and by an animal at that, was a personal affront, an unbearable humiliation that drove her to the brink of madness. Her eyes, once cold and calculating, now gleamed with uncontrolled rage, scanning the edge of the precipice for anything, any object she could use to regain control, to ensure the end she so desired. The daughter, in a fit of blind rage, could not accept defeat, her bloodshot eyes fixed on a large, loose stone, partially buried in the damp earth near the edge. It was too heavy to be pushed with her hands, but madness gave her supernatural strength. She began to kick the base of the stone, scratching her fingers and nails on the earth and small roots. In a wild frenzy, the lion, perceiving the new threat, let out an even graver warning growl, its golden eyes fixed on the crazed figure above. It knew it could not deflect another attack without fully giving way. The mother, inside the cage, watched in paralyzed horror. She saw the murderous determination in her daughter's eyes, the complete absence of humanity. It was like seeing a demon in flesh and blood. The ground beneath the lion and the cage began to vibrate slightly with the daughter's kicks. Small stones and clumps of earth broke off the edge, falling into the turbulent water below. The lion, already exhausted, felt the instability increase. Its hind legs, which were struggling for traction, now found an even more precarious footing. The metal hook, under extreme tension, began to creak more sharply, a sound of metal stretching to its limit. With a last, desperate effort, the daughter managed to dislodge the stone. With a guttural sound of exertion, she pushed it with all her might. The stone rolled heavily over the edge, not falling directly onto the lion or the cage, but striking the rocky bank below the lion's hind legs. The impact was devastating. The rock, already weakened by erosion and constant dampness, gave way. An entire section of the precipice edge, where the lion was precariously balanced, crumbled with a terrifying roar, falling into the abyss. The lion let out a roar of terror and fury, no longer a warning, but a cry of despair. It completely lost the support of its hind legs. Its muscular body twisted violently in the air, trying to grasp onto anything, but there was nothing. The cage, still clamped in its teeth, was dragged with it. For a terrifying instant, the lion and the cage hung suspended in the void, the metal hook snapping, about to break. The mother let out a muffled scream, the air torn from her lungs. She felt the free fall, her stomach churning, the certainty of death swallowing her. The daughter above watched the scene unfold in slow motion. A smile of savage triumph began to form on her lips, but was quickly replaced by an expression of pure horror. The rockfall did not stop where the lion was. The edge of the precipice, already unstable, continued to give way, a deep crack rapidly extending towards her. The ground beneath her own feet began to tremble violently, and she felt the earth move. The roar of the waterfall was suddenly overwhelmed by the deafening sound of the earth splitting apart. The daughter, who had orchestrated her mother's fall, now found herself in mortal danger. The very ground beneath her crumbling, dragging her into the same abyss she so desired for her victim. The ground beneath the daughter's feet, once firm and complicit in her fury, now crumbled into a roar of earth and rock. The smile of triumph, frozen on her lips, transformed into a mask of pure terror. There was no time for screams, only for the overwhelming vertigo of a world turning upside down. She felt the damp, cold earth slip beneath her designer boots, relentless gravity pulling her into the void she herself had dug. The air lashed her face, stealing her breath, and her arms thrashed frantically, searching for something, anything, to grasp, but there was only nothingness. The fall was swift, brutal, a dizzying descent into the same abyss she had destined for her mother. Her eyes, still wide with horror, for a fleeting instant, met the image of the suspended cage, the struggling lion, and the fragile figure of her mother within. A cruel irony, a macabre mirror of her own fate. The scream she tried to unleash remained trapped in her throat, muffled by the deafening sound of the collapse and the eternal roar of the waterfall. She was no longer the predator high above, but the prey, falling, helpless. Towards the same darkness, small stones and clumps of earth accompanied her, ricocheting off her body as she plunged into chaos, the sound of the rock splitting echoing like a final thunderclap. As the daughter plummeted, a mass of terror and fury, the lion, still clinging to the cage's hook, fought against its own annihilation. The loss of its hind leg support threw it into desperate disequilibrium. Its muscular body twisted in the air, front claws scraping at the remaining rock, searching for a grip that wasn't there. The roar of despair that escaped its throat was no longer a warning but pure survival instinct. It hung literally by a thread, the metal hook, which now snapped with frightening frequency, and the brute force of its jaw. Then, amidst the chaos, the mother witnessed the unthinkable. The silhouette of her daughter, a blur of expensive clothes and flowing hair, plummeting from the top of the precipice. There was no triumph in her eyes, only horror and the certainty of a shared fate. For an instant, a complex emotion struck her. Not the joy of revenge, but a paralyzing shock. The sight of her own flesh and blood being swallowed by the same monster she had invoked. The daughter's scream, if there was one, was swallowed by the roar of the waterfall, and her figure quickly disappeared into the mist and darkness below. The lion, with a final effort that seemed to drain every drop of its vital strength, managed, by a miracle of nature, to hook one of its front paws into a small crevice in the rock that still held. It was not a firm support, but it was something. Its body swayed violently, the cage spun, and the mother was thrown against the bars again, a moan escaping her lips. The metal hook, under extreme tension, let out a sharp crack, a sound of metal stretching to its limit, but it did not break. The lion, now with its hind legs dangling in the void, used the strength of its claws and jaw to hold on, its body trembling uncontrollably. It was closer to the waterfall than ever, the force of the current pulling the cage with renewed intensity. The water, before just a mist, now hit it directly, soaking its fur and hindering its vision. Its golden eyes, once filled with fierce concentration, now showed signs of exhaustion, but the obstinacy was still there, a stubborn flame that refused to extinguish. It would not let go, not yet. The mother, inside the cage, felt the swaying like a macabre pendulum, each oscillation a warning of imminent death. She could feel the tremor running through the lion's body, the palpable tension radiating from it. The pain from the trunk's impact still throbbed, but the terror of seeing her daughter fall and the very uncertainty of her own salvation superseded any physical suffering. She was suspended between the fury of nature and the untamed will of a wild king. The daughter's figure had completely disappeared, swallowed by the abyss. There was no sound, no trace. Only the roar of the waterfall, the snap of metal, and the heavy breathing of the lion. The precipice, once a stage for cruelty, was now a tomb for vengeance and a pit of despair. The lion, with its front paw precariously wedged and the cage's hook still clamped in its teeth, made a new effort, a low, guttural growl escaping its throat. It tried to pull, but the rock beneath its paw gave way a little more, and it slipped again, the cage swaying even more violently. The mother's life, and perhaps the lion's own, hung by a thread, suspended between the fury of a vanished daughter and the untamed will of a wild king who refused to give up. The abyss roared, hungry, and time seemed to have stopped, awaiting the inevitable outcome. Time, which had seemed suspended, now accelerated into a whirlwind of terror. The lion's slip was not just a slide. It was the final surrender of the rock beneath its paw, a dry thud that echoed for a millisecond before being swallowed by the roar of the waterfall. The massive feline's body, already exhausted, lost its last shred of support. For an instant that stretched into a cruel eternity, the lion and the cage plummeted, a mass of muscle, metal, and despair falling into the void. Inside, the mother let out a scream no one heard, a sound torn from her gut as her body was hurled against the cage bars. The pain, once a constant companion, now erupted into a symphony of agony. She felt the air sucked from her lungs, her stomach churning in a vortex of dread. The certainty of death embraced her, cold and relentless, as the world spun in a blur of water, rock and sky. Her wide eyes fixed on the metal hook which, under unbearable tension, let out a sharp metallic sound, a lament of tearing iron, stretching beyond any conceivable limit. It was the sound of annihilation, the prelude to the end. The lion, in a roar that was no longer of fury or warning, but of pure and untamed despair, writhed in the air. Its golden eyes, once focused, were now clouded by exhaustion and the lashing water. Its jaw, which held the hook with superhuman strength, trembled, every muscle in its neck and head stretched to the maximum. It was not just falling, it was fighting against gravity itself, against the inexorable pull of the abyss. It was a lost battle, but the instinct for survival, stronger than any pain or fatigue, propelled it to a last desperate act. Amidst the dizzying fall, as the waterfall approached, transforming the mist into a wall of icy, deafening water, the lion did the unthinkable. With a sudden and violent movement, it twisted its body, not to save itself but to reposition the cage. Its desperate front claws scraped at nothingness, searching for a grip that didn't exist. But then, by a brutal miracle, the tip of one of its claws, sharp as a dagger, found a small protrusion on the damp rock, a tiny, almost invisible ledge that had been spared from the collapse. It wasn't a support, it wasn't a crevice, it was just a point of friction, a thread of hope on a precipice of despair. The impact was a violent shock that reverberated through the lion's entire body, tearing a grunt of pain from it. The cage swung with renewed ferocity, throwing the mother from side to side. She felt a rib crack, the sharp pain piercing her already weakened body, but the free fall had stopped. They were suspended again, but in an even more precarious way. The lion was now hanging not by the hook, but by the tip of a single claw embedded in the rock, and by the strength of its jaw that still refused to release the metal hook, now visibly deformed, almost torn. The waterfall's water, which had been a distant mist, now swallowed them. The merciless current pulled the cage with overwhelming force, trying to tear it from the lion's mouth. Icy drops lashed the mother's face. Water invaded the cage, and the deafening roar of the waterfall filled every fiber of her being. She could feel the lion's body trembling, not just from effort, but from cold and exhaustion. Its eyes, once golden and vibrant, now seemed dull, but the flame of obstinacy still burned stubbornly in their depths. The precipice, a tomb for the daughter and a pit of despair for the mother, continued to roar. The absence of the daughter, who moments before had been the personification of fury, was now a deafening void, a cruel irony that hung over the scene. There were no more screams, only the lament of the wind, the sound of the water, and the sharp snap of metal that refused to yield, but was on the verge of collapse. The mother, amidst the pain and terror, looked at the lion, There was no more fear in her eyes, only a strange mixture of admiration and despair. That wild animal, which should have been her predator, was now her only link to life, an improbable guardian fighting to its last breath. She saw the vein pulsing in the lion's muscular neck, the foam on its lips, the superhuman effort to keep the cage suspended. Every fiber of the animal's being screamed in agony, but it did not let go. The rock beneath the lion's claw, already weakened, began to crumble slowly. Small grains of stone and sand fell into the abyss, a premonition that this new support was as ephemeral as the last. The lion, perceiving the new threat, let out a low growl, almost a moan, and tried, with a last surge of energy, to pull the cage closer to the rock wall, searching for any other point of support, but there was nothing. The wall was smooth, damp, and relentless. The waterfall's current, growing stronger, began to spin the cage, making it swing from side to side like an abandoned toy. The mother was thrown against the bars, feeling the impact in every bone of her body. The icy water enveloped her, threatening to drag her out of the cage into the abyss that patiently waited. The metal hook, under the combined force of the current and the weight, emitted a tearing sound, a final, unmistakable sound. One of the hook's points, already deformed, gave way, snapping like a broken bone. The lion let out a roar of fury and frustration, its jaw clenching what remained of the hook. It felt the loss of part of the support, the sudden imbalance. The cage hung dangerously, and the lion, with a final effort, managed to maintain control. But now it was hanging by an even smaller part of the hook, which was about to break completely. Its eyes, once dull, now gleamed with a wild determination, a silent promise that it would not give up, not as long as there was a thread of hope. The mother, seeing the hook break, closed her eyes, expecting the final impact. But it did not come. She opened her eyes and saw the lion, its body trembling, its claw still precariously embedded in the rock, what remained of the hook still in its mouth. They were closer to the end than ever, but they were still there, suspended between life and death, between the fury of nature and the untamed will of a wild king who refused to yield. The abyss roared, but the lion, in its determined silence, roared louder. What remained of the hook, now a twisted shard of metal, seemed to whisper its own surrender. The cage, with its drastically reduced point of support, spun with even greater violence, an uncontrolled top at the edge of the precipice. The mother was hurled against the bars, a silent scream tearing at her throat as the air was again forced from her lungs. She felt the dull thud of her shoulder against the cold metal, a searing pain that added to the symphony of suffering that was already her body. The icy water of the waterfall, which before only lashed her, now engulfed her in waves, invading the cage, threatening to drag her out into the darkness below. She clung to the bars with the strength of despair, her fingers white and numb, nails scraping the rusted metal in a futile attempt to stay clamped. The lion, with its jaw locked on what remained of the hook, felt the abrupt change in weight, the excruciating pull that threatened to tear out its teeth. Its muscles, already pushed to the limit of exhaustion, contracted in painful spasms. The claw, embedded in the rock, was now its only counterpoint. But the rock beneath it continued to crumble, a constant drip of small fragments falling into the void, a macabre clock ticking away the time they had left. Its golden eyes, once filled with fierce concentration, now reflected a deep pain, an internal struggle against imminent failure. It growled again, a hoarse, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of its soul, not of rage, but of pure, untamed will to live. The waterfall's current, like a hungry monster, gripped the cage, trying to tear it from the lion's mouth. Every wave, every swirl was a direct attack, a relentless force seeking annihilation. The cage swayed back and forth, side to side, at an increasingly frantic pace, transforming the mother into a rag doll inside her metal prison. She closed her eyes again, her face wet not only from the water, but from tears that mingled with the current, indistinguishable amidst the chaos. The image of her daughter falling into the abyss flashed in her mind, a cruel memory that refused to disappear. Her daughter's revenge now seemed to have turned against herself, a macabre echo of the cruelty that had led her to this precipice. But then, amidst the vertigo and terror, the mother felt a new vibration. It was not the lion's tremor, nor the cage's sway. It was a different sound, a deep creaking coming from the rock itself. The lion, with a primal instinct, perceived it too. Its eyes, despite exhaustion, widened. The rock beneath its claw, already compromised, began to give way more significantly. It was no longer small fragments. It was a visible crack opening, slowly but inexorably, right beside its paw. The lion tried to move its claw, searching for new support, but there was nowhere to go. The wall was smooth, damp, treacherous. The cage, already hanging by a thread, now felt the weight of the crumbling rock itself. A larger piece, the size of a fist, broke off with a dry snap, falling into the abyss with a sound that was quickly swallowed by the waterfall. The lion, with a roar of despair, tightened its jaw even more, its teeth grinding against the deformed metal. It knew time was running out. The claw, which until then had been its last resort, was now in imminent danger of losing its point of support. The mother, feeling the rock disintegrate, opened her eyes. She saw the crack widen, the lion's claw slipping a millimeter, then another. Panic, which seemed to have been exhausted, resurfaced with renewed force, a silent scream echoing in her mind. She looked at the lion, at its golden eyes that now seemed to plead, not for mercy, but for a strength it no longer possessed. The massive feline's body trembled uncontrollably, every muscle stretched to the maximum, every fiber of its being screaming in agony. The foam on its lips mingled with the waterfall's water, an image of suffering and resilience. The metal hook, now, was not only deformed but began to stretch, to thin at the point of contact with the lion's mouth. It was as if the metal was liquefying under the pressure, about to break at any second. A thread of metal, thin as a hair, appeared on the surface, a micro-fracture that expanded, silent but deadly. The lion felt it. It felt the metal yield, the pressure decrease for a fraction of a second before intensifying again, a warning that the end was inevitable. With a last desperate effort, the lion tried to pull the cage upwards, out of reach of the stronger current, away from the crumbling rock. But its muscles were exhausted, its hind legs dangling in the void, without support. It was a creature of land, not water, and the waterfall was an invincible enemy. The roar of the water was now the only sound, a death chorus that enveloped everything. The mother, seeing the exhaustion in the lion's eyes, felt a wave of compassion and terror. That animal, which was her only hope, was sacrificing itself for her, for a stranger it had saved from the abyss. Suddenly, a louder snap than all the previous ones cut through the air. It didn't come from the hook, it came from the rock. The lion's claw, which until then had resisted, lost its last point of support. The crack opened completely, and a larger piece of the rock face broke off, taking the lion's claw with it. For a millisecond, the lion hung suspended only by the strength of its jaw, the metal hook now the only link between life and death. Its golden eyes, once dull, now gleamed with renewed fury, a last spark of life amidst the imminent darkness. It would not let go, not as long as it could breathe. The abyss roared, but the lion, in its determined silence, roared louder, a final challenge to death itself. The world became a blur of aquatic fury and searing pain. The lion now was a mass of muscle and fur, suspended in the abyss, hanging only by the untamed strength of its jaw. The rock, which for an instant had been its last refuge, had crumbled with a dry snap, taking with it the claw that was its point of support. Its golden eyes, once dull with exhaustion, now burned with renewed fury. A spark of life that refused to be extinguished. It would not let go, not as long as it could breathe. The mother inside the cage felt the abrupt tug, the momentary drop before the lion, with a spasm of brute force, managed to stabilize itself. She was thrown against the bars again, the impact echoing through her already aching body. The air was expelled from her lungs in a silent moan, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on the lion. It was the very personification of resilience, a dethroned king, but not defeated, fighting against an invisible and relentless enemy, nature itself. The metal hook, now a twisted thin shard, was the only link. It groaned, a sharp, metallic sound that mingled with the roar of the waterfall, but which the mother could distinguish with terrifying clarity. The metal stretched, deformed, as if melting under the unbearable pressure. A thread of metal, thin as a hair, appeared on the surface, a micro-fracture that expanded, silent but deadly, promising the imminent end. The lion felt it. It felt the metal yield, the pressure decrease for a fraction of a second before intensifying again, a warning that the end was inevitable. Its hind legs, once firm on the ground, now dangled in the void, lashed by the furious current. The massive feline's body trembled uncontrollably, every muscle stretched to the maximum, every fiber of its being screaming in agony. The foam on its lips mingled with the waterfall's water, an image of suffering and resilience. The lion's jaw was locked, teeth grinding against the deformed metal, a silent struggle against imminent failure. It was a creature of land, not water, and the waterfall was an invincible enemy, a hungry monster gripping the cage, trying to tear it from its mouth. The cage spun, with even greater violence, an uncontrolled top at the edge of the precipice. The mother was hurled in all directions, a rag doll inside her metal prison. The icy water of the waterfall, which before only lashed her, now engulfed her in waves, invading the cage, threatening to drag her out into the darkness below. She clung to the bars with the strength of despair, her fingers white and numb, nails scraping the rusted metal in a futile attempt to stay clamped. The lion, with a last desperate effort, tried to pull the cage upwards, out of reach of the stronger current, away from the crumbling rock. But its muscles were exhausted, its hind legs dangling in the void without support. It growled again, a hoarse, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of its soul, not of rage, but of pure, untamed will to live. Its golden eyes, once filled with fierce concentration, now reflected a deep pain, an internal struggle against imminent failure. The mother, seeing the exhaustion in the lion's eyes, felt a wave of compassion and terror. That animal, which was her only hope, was sacrificing itself for her, for a stranger it had saved from the abyss. The image of her daughter falling into the abyss flashed in her mind, a cruel memory that refused to disappear. Her daughter's revenge now seemed to have turned against herself, a macabre echo of the cruelty that had led her to this precipice. But the lion, in its act of wild heroism, was the counterpoint, proof that life, even in its most brutal form, could harbor a spark of something greater. Suddenly, a different sound cut through the air, sharper than the roar of the water, more strident than the groan of metal. It didn't come from the hook, nor from the rock. It came from the cage itself. One of the metal bars at the point where the hook was attached began to give way. The weld, already rusted and weakened by time, and the violence of the impact, was breaking apart. A thin but visible crack opened, and a dry snap announced that the cage's structure was compromised. The lion, with its keen hearing, perceived the new threat. Its eyes widened. It was no longer just the hook, but the cage itself that threatened to disintegrate. The pressure on its jaw became unbearable, not only from the weight, but from the instability of the structure it held. The cage swayed erratically, its center of gravity shifting with each snap of the metal. The mother felt the bar give way under her hands, the cold, damp metal bending. A cry of despair escaped her lips, but was swallowed by the waterfall. The lion, in a last act of desperation, tried to rotate the cage, seeking an angle that would relieve pressure on the weak point. But the current was too strong, and the cage, with its irregular shape, was dead weight. Its muscles trembled, and a moan escaped its throat, a sound of pure agony. The hook, already stretched to its maximum, now looked like a fishing line about to snap. The microfracture in the metal widened, and the mother saw, with horror, a drop of water trickle through it, a premonition that the end was only seconds away. The lion, its golden eyes fixed on the abyss, knew. It felt the metal tear, the pressure drop drastically. The roar of the water was now the only sound, a death chorus that enveloped everything. The lion, in its determined silence, roared louder, a final challenge to death itself. But the metal, at last, began to yield. The sound that followed was not a snap, but a tear, a metallic lament, sharp and prolonged, that cut through the roar of the waterfall like a hot knife through butter. The thread of metal, thin as a hair, did not break all at once. It stretched, elongated, screamed in agony as the unbearable tension pulled it beyond its limits. The microfracture, which was once a faint line, now opened into a grotesque wound, exposing the corroded interior of the steel. The droplet of water, a macabre premonition, transformed into a trickle, then a gush, as the cage's structure, at the point of connection with the hook, disintegrated. The mother felt the bar give way completely under her hands, the cold, damp metal bending inward as if the cage were swallowing itself. A cry of despair escaped her lips, but was swallowed by the waterfall, which now seemed to laugh, a death chorus that enveloped everything. Her eyes, wide with terror, saw the hook detach, not from the lion, but from the cage itself. The twisted metal, which for so long had been her only hope, was now just a useless piece of scrap, still clamped in the lion's jaw, but with nothing to hold. For a millisecond, the cage hung suspended in the air, a ghost of metal and despair, before gravity, relentless and voracious, claimed it. The world turned upside down. The mother was hurled against the bars, the impact echoing through her already aching body, every bone protesting. The air was expelled from her lungs in a silent moan. The fall was dizzying. A plunge into the abyss that seemed endless. The icy water of the waterfall, which before only lashed her, now engulfed her in waves, invading the cage, threatening to drag her out into the darkness below. She clung to the bars with the strength of despair, her fingers white and numb, nails scraping the rusted metal in a futile attempt to stay clamped. The lion, in a spasm of fury and despair, did not release the hook. Its teeth, still locked on the useless metal, kept it attached to the cage as it plummeted. For an instant, the king of the jungle was dragged along, a mass of muscle and fur suspended in the abyss, hanging only by the untamed strength of its jaw, which now held a piece of metal that held nothing anymore. Its golden eyes, once dull with exhaustion, now burned with renewed fury, a spark of life that refused to be extinguished. It would not let go, not as long as it could breathe. In an act of pure, untamed will, the lion released the useless hook, and in a movement that defied logic and gravity, lunged forward. Its massive body, once exhausted, found a reserve of energy that seemed to come from hell itself. It roared, a hoarse, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of its soul, not of rage, but of pure, untamed will to live. Its golden eyes, once filled with fierce concentration, now reflected a deep pain, an internal struggle against imminent failure. With a precise and desperate strike, its jaws clamped shut again, not on the hook, but directly on the top bar of the cage, right in the middle, where the structure still seemed most solid. The impact was brutal, a dry thud that made the cage swing violently, and the lion felt the searing pain of its teeth clashing against the metal. But it did not let go. Its teeth, sharp as razors, dug into the steel, grinding and scraping but holding. It was a creature of land, not water, and the waterfall was an invincible enemy, a hungry monster gripping the cage, trying to tear it from its mouth. The mother, hurled against the bars again, felt the abrupt tug, the momentary drop before the lion, with a spasm of brute force, managed to stabilize itself. She was thrown against the bars again, the impact echoing through her already aching body. The air was expelled from her lungs in a silent moan. Her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on the lion. It was the very personification of resilience, a dethroned king, but not defeated, fighting against an invisible and relentless enemy, nature itself. The cage now hung in an even more precarious way. There was no hook, only the brute force of the lion's jaw, its teeth embedded directly in the metal. The bar, already rusted and weakened, groaned under the pressure, a sharp, metallic sound that mingled with the roar of the waterfall, but which the mother could distinguish with terrifying clarity. The metal stretched, deformed, as if melting under the unbearable pressure. A thread of metal, thin as a hair, appeared on the surface. A microfracture that expanded, silent but deadly, promising the imminent end. The lion felt it. It felt the metal yield. The pressure decrease for a fraction of a second before intensifying again, a warning that the end was inevitable. Its hind legs, once firm on the ground, now dangled in the void, lashed by the furious current. The massive feline's body trembled uncontrollably, every muscle stretched to the maximum, every fiber of its being screaming in agony. The foam on its lips mingled with the waterfall's water, an image of suffering and resilience. The lion's jaw was locked, teeth grinding against the deformed metal, a silent struggle against imminent failure. The waterfall roared, a monster of water and fury trying to tear the cage from the lion's mouth. The current was a relentless hammer, beating against the cage, pushing it down, into the abyss. The mother inside the cage felt the force of the water, the biting cold, the sensation of being a toy in the hands of a greater force. She looked at the lion, at its golden eyes that now seemed to plead, not for mercy, but for a strength it no longer possessed. That animal, which was her only hope, was sacrificing itself for her, for a stranger it had saved from the abyss. The image of her daughter falling into the abyss flashed in her mind, a cruel memory that refused to disappear. Her daughter's revenge now seemed to have turned against herself, a macabre echo of the cruelty that had led her to this precipice. But the lion, in its act of wild heroism, was the counterpoint, proof that life, even in its most brutal form, could harbor a spark of something greater. Suddenly a new sound, not the tearing of metal, but a dry snap coming from inside the lion's mouth. One of its teeth, under the unbearable pressure, had broken. The pain was excruciating, a sharp pang that made it stagger. For an instant the lion's jaw loosened, and the cage plummeted a few more inches. Before it, with a roar of pain and fury, tightened again, the remaining teeth digging even deeper into the metal. The lion would not let go, not as long as it could breathe. But now, with every breath, the pain pulsed, a constant reminder that the end was near. The abyss roared, but the lion, in its determined silence, roared louder, a final challenge to death itself. And the metal, in turn, continued to yield, now with the help of a broken tooth. The pain was an incandescent spear, piercing the lion's jaw. The snap of bone and enamel echoed not only in its own skull, but in the air. a macabre counterpoint to the roar of the waterfall. Its grip, already a testament to impossible will, faltered, not by choice but by blind, overwhelming agony. The cage, for a breathtaking fraction of a second, plummeted, a nauseating lurch that sent a new wave of terror through the mother. She felt the sudden drop, the stomach-lurching plunge, her body slamming against the cold, relentless bars. Her scream was silent, stolen by the torrent. The lion, however, was not defeated. Not yet. Its eyes, though clouded with pain, burned with a primal fury. It had lost a tooth, a weapon, a part of itself. But the fight was not over. With a guttural growl that was more a gasp of agony, it tightened its grip again. The remaining teeth, now unevenly distributed, dug deeper into the already groaning metal. It was a desperate and agonizing adjustment. The bar, already weakened, now bore the impact of irregular, cutting pressure. It screamed, a sharp metallic lament that cut through the thunder of the water. The microfracture, once a hairline crack, became an irregular tear. The metal, before only deformed, now began to fray, peeling like rotten fruit. Water, cold and relentless, began to seep through the new crevices, not just drops, but thin trickles, chilling the mother to the bone. She watched, mesmerized by the slow, agonizing destruction of her prison, which was also her only shield against the abyss. Each trickle of water was a small, icy finger, tracing the path of her inevitable doom. The lion's body trembled violently, its massive paws, still thrashing uselessly in the churning water below, were numb. The current was a relentless enemy, twisting and pulling the cage, trying to tear it from its weakened grip. It was a statue of pure, raw suffering, every muscle screaming, every nerve ablaze. The broken tooth pulsed with a throbbing pain that threatened to overwhelm it, to force it to release its hold. But something deeper, something ancient and fierce, refused to yield. It was the instinct of a predator, yes, but also the stubborn refusal of a king to surrender its territory, even to the very forces of nature. Its golden eyes, once burning with fierce determination, now held a glint of something more. Profound weariness. It was fighting a battle it could not win, against an enemy that had no face, no weakness, only overwhelming and endless power. The mother, watching it, felt a strange mixture of terror and admiration. This magnificent beast, battered, broken, but still fighting for her. For a moment, the image of her daughter, the architect of this nightmare, vanished. Only the lion remained, a symbol of defiant life against the approaching void. The irregular pressure of its damaged jaw was having a catastrophic effect. The bar, already compromised, began to twist. The cage, no longer held symmetrically, began to spin slowly, erratically in the furious current. The world inside became a blur of water, metal, and sky. The mother was thrown from side to side, her head hitting the bars with nauseating thuds. Dizziness, combined with pain and terror, threatened to consume her. She could feel the cage itself groaning, its structural integrity failing under the new and unpredictable tensions. Each twist was a new assault, each spin a new promise of collapse. The lion, feeling the new instability, let out another growl of pain. It tried to adjust, to compensate for the twisting, but its movements were clumsy, hampered by the pain and the relentless pull of the water. Its head swayed from side to side, its powerful neck muscles stretched, trying to counteract the rotational force. But the current was too strong, too cunning. It exploited every weakness, every tremor, every moment of hesitation. The broken tooth was not just a source of pain, it was an open wound, allowing water to seep into its mouth, making its grip more slippery, less secure. A thin trickle of blood, dark against the white foam of the waterfall, began to mingle with the water around its jaw. It was a clear, visual testament to its sacrifice, a crimson banner of its impending defeat. It knew. It could feel the metal yielding, the bar flattening, stretching, losing its rigidity. The sound was no longer a scream, but a continuous low groan, like a dying beast. The mother also heard it, a sound that resonated deep in her bones. It was the sound of the end, approaching with every agonizing second. Her gaze fell upon the abyss again, a swirling vortex of foam and spray, an endless maw waiting to swallow them whole. She thought of her daughter again, not with anger, but with chilling clarity. This was the ultimate consequence of her daughter's fury, a dance with death orchestrated by a twisted mind. But now it wasn't just her own life at stake. The lion, her improbable savior, was being dragged down with her, a victim of human cruelty. A new snap, louder than the others, tore through the air. It wasn't the bar this time, but one of the cage's vertical supports, stressed beyond its limits by the twisting motion. A section of the cage, near the top, buckled inward, creating an irregular opening. Water, seizing the chance, gushed in with renewed force, threatening to tear the mother from her precarious hold. She gasped, choking on the spray, her fingers slipping on the wet metal. The lion felt the change, the sudden alteration in the cage's weight distribution. Its remaining teeth, now grinding against the twisted metal, began to ache with new intensity. It was losing the battle, slow, painful, but undeniably. Exhaustion was absolute, a heavy shroud that threatened to drag it into unconsciousness. Its muscles, once taut and powerful, now felt like jelly. Its breathing came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the crushing pressure. It attempted one last desperate maneuver. With a surge of adrenaline, it tried to shift its weight, to pull the cage slightly upward, to relieve pressure on the most damaged part of the bar. It was a futile effort. The current was too strong, the cage too heavy, its body too broken. Instead, the sudden movement only exacerbated the problem. The bar, already stretched to its limit, gave a final agonizing groan. The irregular tear widened, splitting the metal like paper. The mother watched, her eyes wide with horror, as the bar began to separate, not just bending, but tearing completely. The lion's grip, though still fierce, was now holding two distinct pieces of metal, each pulling in a different direction. The cage was literally falling apart in its mouth. The end was no longer a distant threat. It was there now, unfolding before her eyes in agonizing, slow motion. The roar of the waterfall intensified, a triumphant crescendo, welcoming them to their watery grave. The roar of the waterfall intensified, a triumphant crescendo, welcoming them to their watery grave. Then, the sound the mother feared more than any other tore through the air. It was not a snap, nor a groan, but a sharp shriek of tortured metal, a lament of steel breaking apart. The bar, already stretched and frayed, finally gave way. Instead of breaking into two clean pieces, the metal tore irregularly, like wet paper, but with the fury and violence of an explosion. The lion's grip, which before held a continuous structure, now found itself clinging to two twisted and sharp metal ends, each pulling in a chaotic direction. The cage, deprived of its structural integrity at the point of support, reacted with nauseating violence. The top, where the lion bit, did not completely separate, but collapsed inward, like a crushed can. The vertical bars bent and twisted, creating a tangled metal funnel that closed in on the mother. The impact of the rupture sent a brutal shock through the entire structure, and the cage, once a prison, was now a disintegrating coffin. She plummeted several meters in an instant, a dizzying dive that stole her breath and threw her against the inner bars with overwhelming force. Her head struck again, and for a moment, stars danced in her blurred vision. The water, relentless and opportunistic, took advantage of the new devastation. The cracks and openings, once thin trickles, were now portals for the torrent. The cage, already partially submerged and spinning, rapidly filled with the icy, frothing water of the waterfall. The mother gasped, water invading her mouth and nose, burning her lungs. She thrashed, desperately trying to find a foothold, but the twisted metal and the internal current pushed and pulled her mercilessly. It was like being swallowed alive by a giant washing machine, each rotation a new promise of drowning. The lion, in turn, let out a roar that was more a cry of pure agony. The pain of the broken tooth was now an open wound, throbbing in its jaw, and the sharp edges of the torn metal dug even deeper into its flesh. Its grip, once a rock, was now a desperate effort to grasp the unattainable. It felt the cage disintegrating, the mass distorting, the two halves it held struggling to separate. Its golden eyes, once filled with fury and determination, now burned with an exhaustion that bordered on unconsciousness. Blood, once a trickle, now flowed more freely from its mouth, staining the white foam a pale, macabre pink. It was losing the battle. There was no longer any doubt. Its muscles, which once seemed made of iron, now trembled uncontrollably, every fiber screaming in protest. The current, sensing the weakness, redoubled its attack, twisting the cage with renewed force, trying to tear the pieces of metal from the lion's mouth. It was a fight against time, against pain, against nature itself. And the lion was losing. The mother, half drowned, half crushed, raised her eyes to the lion. Its eyes, even blurred by pain and fatigue, still held a spark of something untamed. It was sacrificing itself for her, for a stranger, to its last breath. The image of her daughter, the architect of her torment, returned with painful clarity. What cruel irony! The daughter, so full of hatred, had condemned her to this end, but a wild animal, for no apparent reason, was fighting to save her. Her daughter's revenge now seemed small and petty compared to the brutal grandeur of the lion's sacrifice. Suddenly, the cage gave a new lurch. One of the pieces of metal the lion held, one of the twisted ends, slipped. It didn't fully detach, but slid, scraping against the lion's remaining teeth. A sound of metal against enamel that made the animal let out a hoarse gasp of pain. The movement further unbalanced the already precarious structure. The cage, now more a shapeless mass of metal than a prison, spun violently, and the mother was thrown to the bottom, her head submerged in the icy water. She felt the oxygen draining from her lungs, a darkness beginning to close in on her vision. The lion, in a last and desperate act of will, tried to clench again, but its muscles were failing. Its jaw, already exhausted and wounded, no longer responded with the same strength. It felt the other piece of metal, the one still more firmly attached, begin to slip as well. It was the end. It could feel it, the weight of the cage, the force of the water, the excruciating pain, all combined to drag it down. Its eyes, now almost closed, fixed for an instant on those of the woman inside the cage, a silent recognition, a farewell. The cage, with a final groan of metal, began to disintegrate in its mouth. It did not separate into two halves, but the point of support completely gave way, the bars bending outward and downward like petals of a wilting steel flower. The lion was now holding only fragments, pieces of metal that could no longer bear the weight. Gravity, the current, the fury of the waterfall, finally won. With a last weak growl, lost in the thunder of the water, the lion felt its grip yield, not by choice, but by failure. Exhaustion was a heavy shroud, pain a paralyzing venom. The cage, now a shapeless, unsupported mass, began its final descent. The lion let go. It was not a choice, but a brutal failure of flesh and metal. The roar of the waterfall, which had been a distant thunder, now became a deafening scream, a chorus of welcome to the abyss. The cage, already a twisted mass of metal, plummeted. It was not a smooth slide, but a violent freefall, a dizzying plunge that tore the air from the mother's lungs and threw her against the inner bars with overwhelming force. Her screams, if they existed, were swallowed by the fury of the water, transformed into a suffocating gurgle as the cage plunged into the white, icy foam. The initial fall was swift, brutal. The mother felt her stomach rise to her throat, a nauseating sensation of absolute helplessness. The world spun, a chaotic mix of grey, white, and the dark blue of the approaching abyss. The water, already invading the cage, now gushed through all the newly created openings, filling the space rapidly. She gasped, the salty, icy water invading her mouth and nostrils, burning her already aching lungs. Her eyes, wide with horror, tried to focus, but her vision was a blur of foam and darkness. The impact of the water against the cage's metal was an incessant drumming, each beat a reminder of the increasing speed of her descent. Up above, the lion, with a last and desperate effort, managed to avoid being dragged down completely. Its claws, sharp as razors, tore into the wet granite of the rock, finding a minuscule fissure, a tenuous hope amidst the chaos. It clung on, its hind muscles trembling under the effort, its body swaying dangerously over the void. Blood streamed from its mouth and paws, but the instinct for survival was stronger than the pain. It watched, its golden eyes fixed on the plummeting cage, a dark speck swallowed by the waterfall's mist. A low growl, almost a lament, escaped its throat. It had failed. The image of the woman, of her eyes, of her struggle, etched in its mind. Inside the cage, the mother was being thrashed. Each rotation of the deformed structure threw her from side to side, her limp limbs striking against the twisted metal. The wheelchair, her only anchor, was now an additional danger, loose and uncontrolled, ricocheting off the inner walls. A particularly strong blow struck her head, and for an instant, darkness threatened to engulf her, but a spark of rage, of pure and obstinate will to live, ignited within her. She would not die like this. She would not be swallowed by this abyss, a victim of her own daughter's cruelty. She fought, even without knowing against what. She tried to cling to the bars, but the metal was slippery, covered with moss and water. The internal current of the cage, now an aquatic trap, pulled her down into the corners, to the center. She could feel the pressure increasing in her ears, the air thinning in her lungs. The sound of the waterfall was no longer a roar, but a vibration that resonated in her bones, a melody of destruction. The abyss, before only a visual threat, was now a physical presence, a vacuum pulling her inward. Suddenly the fall seemed to slow for a brief, agonizing moment. The cage hit something. It wasn't an impact that stopped the fall, but a glancing blow, a violent scrape against a rocky protrusion hidden by the mist. The metal groaned, snapped, and twisted even further, and the cage spun uncontrollably like a maddened top. The mother was flung to the side, feeling a sharp pain in her rib. But the blow had an unexpected effect. The force of the impact tore the wheelchair from its place, flinging it out of the cage through one of the newly created openings. For an instant, the mother felt a strange relief, the loss of a weight, though the pain was intense. The cage, now even more damaged and with a larger opening, continued its descent but with a new tilt. Water gushed with renewed fury, and the mother, without the support of the chair, was dragged to the lowest part of the cage, where the water already reached her chest. She tried to lift her head, searching for air, but each movement was a struggle against the internal current. Her eyes, still fixed on the darkness below, saw something. It was not the bottom, but a dark and indistinct mass that seemed to approach rapidly. Was it the bottom of the abyss, or something more? The lion, high above, still precariously hanging, watched with wild intensity. It could feel the vibration of the fall through the rock, the tremor of the earth beneath its paws. It could not see the cage, swallowed by the mist, but it could sense its presence, the trajectory of its fall. A new growl, stronger, more urgent, escaped its throat. There was something down there. It did not know what, but the waterfall had its secrets, its hidden depths, and the cage was falling directly into them. Exhaustion was still a heavy shroud, but the sight of the disappearing cage, the sound of the distant impact, ignited a new flame in its eyes. The battle was not over, not for the woman, and perhaps not for it. The mother, feeling the cage accelerate again, closed her eyes. She could feel the cold of the abyss, the thin air, the crushing pressure. Her entire life flashed before her eyes, not like a movie, but as flashes of emotions, the joy of her youth, the pain of her paralysis, her daughter's rage, and now the strange gratitude for the lion, her improbable savior. She opened her eyes one last time, determined to face her destiny. The dark mass below was closer now, revealing itself not as the bottom, but as a series of jagged rocks, sharp stone teeth, waiting to tear the cage to pieces. The impact would be inevitable, and death this time seemed certain. The cage, a metal coffin, was about to shatter. The mother's eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and a strange resignation, fixed on the sharp teeth of the waterfall. They were not animal teeth, but stone, jagged rocks emerging from the mist like the fangs of a primordial beast, ready to chew through metal, flesh, hope itself. There was no more time for complex thoughts, for the pain of her daughter's betrayal, for gratitude to the lion. There was only the present, the fall, the inevitable. The thin air in her lungs was a cruel reminder of life ebbing away, a final whisper before silence. She could smell the damp rock, the metallic scent of fear, and rising from the depths, the sweet, nauseating smell of imminent death. The cage, her makeshift coffin, accelerated, and the roar of the waterfall was no longer a distant sound, but a vibration that consumed her, a tremor that resonated in her bones, promising the end. She did not close her eyes. Not this time. She would face it. Face death, face the consequence of her daughter's hatred, face the abyss. A last thought, fleeting as an air bubble in water, went to the lion, the strange guardian who had fought for her, a bitter gratitude, a recognition of wild beauty amidst inhumanity. Then the world became a blur of pain and sound. It was not a single impact, but a symphony of destruction, a series of thunderous blows, a concert of tearing metal, shattering stone, and exploding water. The cage, already weakened, could not withstand the abyss's fury. The bars, which once protected her, now became weapons, twisting and piercing the space around her with blind violence. A scream, muffled by the water and the waterfall's thunder, escaped her lips as her body was violently thrown against the twisted metal, against the cold, relentless rock, against nature's own fury. She felt excruciating pain throughout her body, an electric shock that coursed through her, threatening to extinguish her consciousness. The sound of metal groaning and breaking was deafening, a final lament of a structure surrendering to gravity and the force of the water. The water, before only at her chest, now completely engulfed her, mixed with fragments of metal and foam, a chaotic maelstrom dragging her down into the darkness. When the cacophony subsided, replaced by a distorted underwater silence, the mother found herself in a new hell. The cage had not completely shattered, but had transformed into an even deadlier trap. The jagged rocks had torn through the bottom and sides, creating irregular openings, but also trapping her in a tangled mess of twisted metal. She was submerged, trapped, the icy water invading her already aching lungs. The darkness was almost total. Only a few weak rays of greenish light filtered through the murky water, revealing the extent of the destruction. She tried to move, but her limbs were caught. One arm bent at an odd angle, one leg immobilized by a metal bar that pierced her. The taste of blood filled her mouth, mingling with the salty water and moss. She was wounded, gravely wounded, but still alive. A cold rage, a fierce determination ignited in her chest. She would not die there, not like this. Not after everything, not after the lion. Up above, the lion felt the impact. It didn't see, for the mist swallowed everything, but it felt it. A violent vibration that coursed through the rock beneath its claws, a tremor that resonated in its exhausted body, echoing the destruction below. A guttural roar, more of frustration than pain, escaped its throat. It had failed. The image of the woman, of her eyes, of her struggle, etched in its mind, was a torment. But instinct, stronger than exhaustion, stronger than pain, propelled it. It could not simply give up, not after coming so close. Its muscles, once failing, found a reserve of strength it didn't know it possessed. With a monumental effort, it pulled its body upward, its sharp claws tearing into the damp rock, finding purchase in every small fissure, every precarious ledge. It didn't know what awaited it below, but the waterfall had its secrets, its hidden depths, and the lion now was determined to uncover them. It began to descend, not by free fall, but by climbing, slipping, using every ledge, every exposed root, every piece of rock to approach the abyss, the point of impact. Its golden eyes, fixed on the mist dancing over the precipice, searched for a sign, a sound, anything that indicated it wasn't too late. The icy wind lashed its fur, and the waterfall's water whipped it. But it persisted, driven by a force that transcended mere survival. Inside the submerged cage, the mother fought against the darkness, the pain, and the overwhelming pressure of the water. The water, cold and heavy, pulled her down, towards the inertia of death. Her lungs burned, desperate for air. Every fiber of her being cried out for oxygen. She tried to free herself, but the twisted metal was a deadly embrace, a steel labyrinth that held her with invisible claws. And then she saw. It was not the bottom of the abyss, not the total darkness that awaited. Through one of the newly created openings from the impact, a stronger, pulsating beam of light seemed to come from a crevice in the rock, an underwater tunnel that opened to the side, away from the main fall. The current, which before dragged her down, now seemed to pull her weakly, but with a defined direction, towards this crevice. It was a chance, a minuscule, almost imperceptible chance, but a chance, a spark of hope amidst despair. With a strength bordering on a miracle, she twisted her body, ignoring the searing pain that coursed through her, trying to disentangle herself from the metal that held her. Her fingers scraped the bars, searching for leverage, a point of support. Oxygen was running out, her vision darkening at the edges, the ringing in her ears intensifying. But the image of the crevice, of the light, was a beacon in her mind, a promise of air, of life. She had to get there. She had to try. The lion, high above, felt a new tremor, more subtle, coming from below. It wasn't the impact, but something more. A movement, a deviation. Its eyes widened. The woman was still alive, and she was moving. It redoubled its efforts, the roar of the waterfall no longer a lament, but a hunting song, a call to action. It was coming. It was descending, each claw a hook, each muscle a spring, in a desperate race against time, against the current, against the abyss itself. The crevice in the rock, a secret of the waterfall, now revealed itself as a new path, a new hope. But would it be salvation, or just a new kind of trap? The lion did not know. It only knew it had to get there. The mother, caught in the deadly embrace of twisted metal, felt the oxygen draining away. Every second was an eternity of pain and despair. The taste of blood and moss in her mouth was a cruel reminder of her mortality. Her lungs burned, crying out for air, but the icy water was an impenetrable wall. Her vision darkened at the edges, the ringing in her ears intensified, a funereal chorus announcing the end. But the light, that greenish beam coming from the crevice in the rock, pulsating, almost an underwater heartbeat, was her beacon. A promise of air, of life, of a chance, however small. With a strength that seemed to come from a place beyond her injured body, she twisted her torso, ignoring the searing pain that coursed through her. The arm that was bent at an odd angle now writhed in a desperate attempt to free itself. The rusted metal scraped her skin, tearing flesh, but she felt nothing. Not now. Her fingers, once fragile, were now claws, searching for any point of support, any leverage on the twisted bars that held her. The current, weak but persistent, pulled the cage towards the crevice, a silent invitation to the unknown. She pushed, pulled, twisted. The metal groaned, but did not fully yield. Her leg, immobilized by a piercing bar, was an anchor of pain. But the mother's mind was focused. The crevice. The light. She had to get there. She had to try. Her eyes, wide in the murky darkness, fixed on the opening, as if the very intensity of her gaze could tear through the metal and water. A last breath, a last effort. She felt a snap, not of bone, but of metal, and one of the bars holding her gave way slightly, just enough for her to move her torso a little more, to project her head forward, towards the light. Up above, the lion felt it, the subtle tremor, the deviation of the fall, the vibration of a fight that had not ended. The woman was still alive, and she was moving. A guttural roar, more of determination than of rage, escaped its throat. Its golden eyes, fixed on the mist dancing over the precipice, searched for the exact spot. It could feel the energy of life, even through the barrier of water and rock. It redoubled its efforts, each claw a hook, each muscle a spring. The damp, slippery rock was a challenge, but it mastered it. It descended with surprising agility for its size, slipping over ledges, using every fissure, every exposed root, every piece of rock to approach the abyss. The icy wind lashed its fur, the waterfall's water whipped it, but it persisted, driven by a force that transcended mere survival. It was not just hunting, it was rescuing. Then it saw her. Not the entire cage, but a glimpse. A tangled mess of twisted metal, partially submerged, being dragged by the current towards the crevice. The crevice, a new danger or perhaps a new chance. It could not wait. There was no time to calculate, to plan. The woman was drowning, and the cage was about to be swallowed by the crevice, lost forever in the waterfall's maw. A powerful roar, a battle cry that echoed over the thunder of the waterfall, escaped its throat. It took a leap, its hind legs propelling its massive body from the rock. It was not a jump, it was a dive, a blind plunge into the fury of the water, into the mist, into the abyss. The impact with the water's surface was violent, a shock that rattled it to its bones, but it did not hesitate. Its eyes, even beneath the murky water, searched for the hook. The current was relentless, pulling it down, disorienting it. But instinct was stronger. It felt the metal, the smell of the cage, the presence of the woman. Its teeth, sharp as razors, sought the anchoring point. The cage was spinning, being sucked into the crevice. It saw the hook, the same hook the daughter had used to throw her into the abyss, now half loose, half attached to one of the upper bars. With a swift and precise movement that defied the logic of gravity and current, the lion snatched the hook. Its teeth dug into the cold, damp metal, an iron grip that would not yield. The weight of the cage, the water and the woman was a shock, pulling it down with brutal force. Its muscles roared in protest, but it resisted. It would not let go. Not now. The cage, which was about to be swallowed by the crevice, stopped. No, it didn't stop. It was pulled upwards, slowly, painfully, out of the swirling current that dragged it towards the crevice. The lion, precariously hanging, with the cage's hook firmly clamped between its teeth, fought against the waterfall's fury. Its body was stretched, every muscle tense, its hind legs thrashing in the water, searching for support, anything that would help it maintain its position. Inside the cage, the mother felt the jolt. The fall stopped. The suction of the crevice lessened. She was being pulled upwards, out of the imminent darkness. Her eyes, almost lifeless, saw the light of the surface, still distant, but now a real possibility. She didn't know how, But she knew she was no longer falling. She was suspended, suspended between life and death, between the fury of the waterfall and the untamed strength of a lion. The roar of the water was still deafening, but now, behind it, she could feel the vibration of a force, of a life holding her. The lion. It had found her. It was holding her. But for how long? The tension was palpable, an invisible thread connecting the mother's life to the lion's exhausted jaw. The tension was palpable, an invisible thread connecting the mother's life to the lion's exhausted jaw. Its teeth, once instruments of hunt and power, were now the last bastion against the abyss, embedded in the cold, damp metal of the hook. Every muscle fiber of its massive body screamed in protest, stretched to the limit, defying its very anatomy. The weight of the cage, the water, and the woman was a brutal anchor, pulling it down with a force that seemed to want to disarticulate its jaw, rip its teeth from their roots. The roar of the waterfall, once a distant lament, was now a deafening thunder, a physical presence that lashed it, that tried to drag it into the depths. Its hind legs, desperate, thrashed in the frothing water, searching for a foothold that didn't exist, only the liquid chaos that enveloped it. Its golden eyes, once so piercing, were clouded, bloodshot, fixed on nothing but the impossibility of its task, to hold, just to hold. A trickle of blood, warm and metallic, began to seep from its gums, mingling with the icy water of the waterfall, a cruel reminder of the fragility of its own flesh against the relentless force of nature. Every breath was a battle, a desperate gasp for air amidst the mist and the deafening noise. It was a creature of instinct, a predator at the top of the food chain, but now it was just a point of resistance, a last barrier between life and death. Inside the cage, the mother felt every vibration of that titanic struggle. A subtle tremor ran through the twisted metal, the icy water, and seeped into her bones, into her soul. She was suspended, a fragile pendulum between the distant light of the surface and the imminent darkness of the crevice, which still pulsed just below. Her lungs burned, a hell of pain that cried out for oxygen, but the water, though no longer pulling her towards the crevice, still filled her mouth, her nose. The taste of blood and moss was constant, the taste of fear and of a fading hope. But there was hope, a wild, desperate hope. She was not falling. She was being held. Why or by whom, she couldn't fully comprehend, but the brute force, the untamed determination, was undeniable. She tried to move, tried to shift her weight, anything to ease the burden on whatever was holding her, but her body was a prison of pain and twisted metal. Her broken arm throbbed. Her pierced leg sent electric shocks with every minimal movement. She was helpless, a puppet in the hands of fate, and the thread that kept her alive was clamped in the exhausted jaw of a beast. The lion groaned, a guttural sound lost in the roar of the waterfall. Its jaw ached, its neck and shoulder muscles were in spasms. The hook, now slippery with water and blood, threatened to escape. Its head lowered, an inch, then another. The cage swayed, a terrifying lurch that sent a new wave of panic through the mother. The crevice, the dark mouth of the underwater tunnel, seemed to pulse just below, a silent invitation to oblivion. She watched, eyes wide in the murky darkness, as the lion's head, partially visible through the churning water, trembled. Its teeth, though still clenched, seemed to lose their grip. The weight, the impossible weight, was winning. It could not hold on forever. No creature could defy such forces indefinitely. But then, a new surge of strength. A primal roar, not of pain, but of pure and untamed defiance, tore from the lion's throat. Its powerful neck muscles contracted, its shoulders rippled. It was not just holding, it was trying to pull. Slowly, agonizingly, inch by inch, it began to move, not upward but sideways, towards the rocky wall of the gorge.